the meeting is politically left, it would be improper to start on time. So, my name is Bernie Hammond, and I'm here representing the Centre for Social Concern at King's College. The Centre has been in existence now. This is our 30th year of bringing speakers in to talk about a variety of social justice issues. I'm going to say a few words of introduction in a moment. Before I do that, I want to thank our co-sponsors for the event. We have with us Tim Carey, who's president of Local 27 of the Canadian Auto Workers Union here, and I'm going to ask him to say a few words in a moment. Also, Patty Dalton is here. Where'd Patty go?
So right here.
Okay.
Thanks.
Who is president of the London District Labour Council. Josh Lambier, who is with Public Humanities London at Western, and he is one of the, he and his organization, one of the sponsors of the event today. And also Juan Diego Castro, who's over there, is with SURLA, Students United in Representation of Latin America. So I'm going to turn it over to Tim now, just to say a few words of welcome on behalf of the labor movement. And there you go.
Well, I don't know if I need that, Bernie. I usually get by without one of those. In most places, anyway. Just, you know, maybe you should wear it. Okay. Just first of all, when Bernie contacted us to help to sponsor this, it was actually, you know, a no-brainer as far as we're concerned. And actually, in class and the student movement, the first time I met a spokesperson from CLASSE was at the Quebec TCA council that was in Montebello. Was that last year or earlier this year? Earlier this year, and that's where I believe I saw you speak there. So obviously for us, this whole battle is a battle that we support. It's not difficult to know why labor should be supporting this battle. The fight for education is a working class issue. The 1% isn't worried about their kids going to university or getting an education. It's an issue for the 99%. And it's an issue for working people. To be able to, one, keep a job, which is more and more difficult today, and two, have the hopes and aspirations that their children can go to school and go all the way through to university. I never had that good fortune, being raised in poverty, and I certainly don't want to see that continue to happen. So the fight in Quebec, it's not a free process, so I'm so proud of what Quebec does, not only for the students done, but the progressive legislation in Quebec, the fights on social justice issues in Quebec is something that people in Ontario, quite frankly, should be aspiring to. Students in Ontario should be aspiring to $7 a day daycare. We should be looking at the Quebec model and saying maybe if we did, we'd have a better country. So we're so proud to be a sponsor. So proud to have you here in London. I know it's been here now third time, I believe. So hopefully, it would be nice if we had all those students out there welcoming homecoming right now. But anyway, they're having their fun. But at the same time, we have serious issues to deal with. We have serious governments that are attacking us on a daily basis. We've got provincial governments that say that parties can't have the right to collective bargaining. We got the highest tuition fees anywhere in the country. Here in Ontario, we've got a government that's going to take away a right to strike fundamental to workers and the teachers and others. So, boy, I tell you, if there's not a time for a fight back, I don't know what is. So, we'll be there with you in support as labor. There's no doubt about it. You inspire us. We want to be like you. So thank you so much for coming, and everybody here, thank you so much.
So we don't really do homecoming in Quebec. Maybe that's. Hi everybody. My name is Ethan Cox. I'm a journalist with Rabble.ca and Canada.com. First of all, I want to thank you all so much for coming out. It's really great to see all of you here. And it's actually the first stop on a tour that's going to take us all the way out west to Vancouver. So we're really excited, but it's also our first stop, so there might be a few bugs that need to be worked out. So, so before we go on, I just wanted to introduce my fellow panelists. This is Cloé Zawadzki-Turcotte, and she's a former executive with CLASSE and a university student at the University of Quebec at Montreal. And Gabriel Nadeau-Dubois doesn't really need too much introduction. He's the former spokesperson for CLASSE and probably the most recognizable face of the student movement in Quebec. Unlock my notes here. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the political context in Quebec. Can people hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. I got a big voice too. Try and situate things. And then we're going to go to Gabriel, who's going to talk, what did you what's Vietnam? Yeah, what's the background to the student strike and the student movement in Quebec. And then Cloé is going to talk more about the sort of nuts and bolts and the specifics of what was done in order to be able to build up to the student strike and to this mobilization. Because it didn't come out of nowhere, and it wasn't a matter of snapping fingers and going, okay, great, now we got 400,000 people in the street. So I guess first of all, I'll just give you a quick primer on Quebec politics because not everybody may be familiar. Prior to the election that just happened, the Quebec Liberals of Jean Charest were in power for 9 years, and he is an extremely right-wing neoliberal government which tried twice to attack students. First in 2005, when currently the loan and bursary system in Quebec works that when people get a loan, 60% of that is a bursary that they don't have to repay, and 40% is a loan. And so in 2005, the Quebec government tried to transform the bursary into a loan so that loans would be 100% repayable. And there was a major student strike at that time, which also succeeded and was able to force the government to back down and restore the system to the way it was. And then again, obviously, this year, the government tried to raise tuition massively, and again, we're beaten. And so, you know, it's somewhat incontestable that what just happened in Quebec was a major victory for the students. The resume of the student strike in the province of Quebec is the resignation of 2 education ministers, the defeat of a premier and a sitting government, and the repeal of not only the tuition hike, but also Law 12. And for those of you who are not familiar with that, that's a law that was brought in by the Charest government about midway through the strike to try and quell protests. It was condemned by everyone from the United Nations High Commissioner on Human Rights to every human rights and civil liberties group, the Quebec Bar Association representing lawyers and prosecutors in the province. It required anyone who wanted to hold a protest to give the police 8 hours notice and allow the police to say, no, you can't have a protest. It barred protests within 15 years of an educational institution, which effectively barred protests in downtown Montreal because we have so many educational institutions with scattered campuses that there isn't really any real estate that wouldn't be covered by that. And it also suspended the winter semester to be continued prior, just started when September. And so it's been a major victory in Quebec, but it's not a complete victory. And I think what you're going to hear from these guys is that the goal of CLASSE is to move towards free education. And it's a mistake when we talk about education funding to really get bogged down in the dollars and cents of it. I've done a lot of research on the public policy side of education. I was an executive with the student union during the strike in 2005. I was a student militant for many, many years. And since then, you know, when you're a student militant, your perspective is a little bit simpler. It should be free, and therefore we want it to be free. Having done the research and the work on a public policy basis, the flip side of that is we should all want it to be free. Education is the single best investment that any government can make in the future prosperity of society. A number of studies have been done in Europe and here that show that for every dollar invested in post-secondary education returns $10 over the lifetime of a graduate in the higher taxes that they pay. So really, regardless of your perspective, regardless if you're a right-winger and you don't believe in helping people out, if you just want to have a prosperous society, it makes absolute sense to make education free and to have people repay that investment through a progressive taxation scheme, rather than saddling students at the beginning of their lives when they're least able to pay with crushing debt loads to allow them to pay off the cost of their education over their life through a fair and progressive taxation system. And another thing that often gets overlooked in this conversation is that when most of our students are graduating from university with crushing debt loads, what that means is that when they come out of university, they're forced to immediately seek the highest paying job that they can. So whereas in the past, the top graduates from any law school would go and start storefront legal aid clinics. Now they don't have that option. They have to go and get a job with a big law firm because they need to pay back their loans. Whereas in the past, Steve Jobs would fool around in his garage and invent Apple. Well, there's no room for that, because the Steve Jobs, if he graduated from university today, would have too much debt to do that, and he'd need to go find a job right away. And you know, people that graduate and want to go into the public service, that want to help other people and take a lower paying job because it's socially beneficial, they're not able to do that either. So something that's often overlooked is the impact of student debt on society in terms of how much it discourages people from going into volunteerism, into public service, even into entrepreneurship. So I guess to get back to the political context in Quebec, I'll just give you quickly, so there's the Liberal Party, which is the extremely right-wing party. There's the Parti Québécois, which is the sovereigntist party. It used to be a fairly left-wing party. Under René Lévesque, it was a fairly left-wing party. It's moved far, far, far away from that. Been led by people like Lucien Bouchard, Jacques Parizeau, Bernard Landry, who are all themselves fairly neoliberal. I think Pauline Marois is perhaps the most left-wing leader that people have had in a little while, but that really isn't saying much. And she certainly isn't an ally. She's more of an opportunist. And the PQ really contorted themselves into pretzels over the course of the student strike, because at first they put on red squares to support the student movement, and then decided, oh, whoops, this is kind of a little bit of a liability going into an election campaign. We're going to take off these red squares and start doing that. And then what was really interesting is in the last 2 weeks of this election campaign, when the chips were really down and the PQ was asking for a majority, the way that they chose to do that with large ads in the metro, in buses, and all over the place in newspapers, those ads said only a PQ majority can repeal the tuition hikes and cancel Law 12. And of course that was a lie, as we've seen, because they had a majority and they were able to do those things. But as an observer of politics, as somebody who was covering the election quite closely, I thought it was really fascinating that the party that won the election put all of their energy and all of their campaigning over the crucial last 2 weeks of the campaign into appealing to supporters of the student movement. This in the face of Jean Charest and the Liberal Party spending most of the year trying to demonize the students. I don't think Charest ever missed an opportunity to accuse the students of violence and intimidation. We should have auto-tuned this. We did a lot of clips of him saying that. But anyway, so those are the two historical main parties in Quebec. There was a third party called the ADQ, which was a more sort of extreme right-wing party, which was folded into the CAQ, which is the Coalition Avenir Québec, so the Coalition for Quebec's Future. And basically, I think the best way to describe the CAQ is this was sort of a response from a lot of the elite, a lot of what you might call the 1%, to the fact that the Liberal government was dogged by corruption scandals. And so it was sort of a situation where the Liberal government had been in power for 9 years. Everybody in the province of Quebec is fully aware that they could not be more corrupt. We have the Charbonneau Commission going on right now. It's becoming quite clear that we're overpaying by about 30 to 35% on all of our public works projects in what we call a corruption tax, which goes to the mafia and assorted organized criminals. So you had an extremely corrupt government that had been in power for a long time that was looking likely to be defeated. And so the CAQ was sort of the arguably even more right-wing replacement for the Liberals. And so those were the three main parties. All of them were pretty terrible. And then you have Quebec Solidaire, which is also a sovereigntist party, a smaller party, a left-wing party. It's a movement party. It started with a merger originally between Union des Forces Progressistes, which was a small left-wing party, and François David's Option Citoyenne. And that party is the only party that really supported the student movement throughout. And throughout the course of the strike, Quebec Solidaire was in the streets at every demonstration, and they really are a democratic and progressive party. And in the end, they were only able to get 2 seats in the election, unfortunately. So what we have coming out of the election is a PQ minority, which luckily was able to repeal the tuition hikes and Law 12 by executive order. But they're going to have a fair bit of difficulty governing, because even with the support of Quebec Solidaire, they don't have enough seats to form a majority. So it's going to be an interesting political climate in Quebec. I think the government's probably only going to last about a year to 18 months. Neither the Liberals nor the CAQ are in a real rush to have another election right away, because they need to, in case the Liberals find a new leader, and restock their war chest. But we're going to be having another election in Quebec shortly. And yeah, I guess that's the political context. So the other thing I wanted to touch a little bit on, people often ask, I think that the biggest question that people ask is, what's the difference between Quebec and the rest of Canada? And why is this possible in Quebec and it doesn't happen elsewhere? And I actually went to university in New Brunswick, so I have a little bit of experience outside of the province. And really, I think that the most important difference is that in Quebec, the majority of students see their student union as their most direct level of political representation. They really look to the student union as their voice, and the voice for their concerns, much more so than they do to any municipal or provincial or federal government. And in the rest of the country, unfortunately, student unions generally are seen as some sort of a social club with a mandate to hold parties and give out free beer. And one of the reasons for that difference, and one of the reasons why people are so invested in Quebec, is because of the democratic nature of student unions in Quebec. They have regular general assemblies where students come, debate issues, and take decisions collectively. And the reason why this strike, in my opinion, was so successful was because of the amount of grassroots buy-in. And if you have a situation where you have a representative democracy and you have an elected executive that decide, okay, we're going on strike, I'm not sure that students are going to sacrifice a semester for that strike. I'm not sure that students are going to go to the wall the way that they did. And I think it's really important to know that the most effective way to get people mobilized and engaged is to give them buy-in, to give them a voice, to make them feel a part of the decision. Because if they feel that they made the decision to go on strike, they're going to defend that strike to their last breath, which is not going to happen if they elected somebody that did it. I have two other things I wanted to talk about. One of which is free education is a concept that gets talked about a lot in the media. It's referred to universally as a pipe dream, a ridiculous impossibility. Quebec students have taken a lot of shit from the mainstream media for being pie in the sky idealists who don't understand how the real world works. So I just wanted to share some facts with you about education funding. In Quebec, it's estimated by IRIS, which is a social policy research think tank in Montreal, that the cost of completely free education to the province of Quebec would be around $350 million a year. And that's after taking into account savings from redundant programs such as administration of tuition and loans and bursaries and stuff like this. So $350 million a year is less than 3% of the annual budget of the education industry. It's nothing. To put it in context, Jean Charest's government eliminated a 0.98% tax on financial transactions in 2011, which would have paid for free education almost twice. And this at a time when around the world everybody was clamoring for taxes on financial transactions, not even for the revenue that they generate, but just for the disincentive to the kind of rampant speculation that tanked the global economy in 2008. Between 2000 and 2008, the Quebec government reduced its revenue by over $10 billion and reduced it significantly since. And almost all of that money went into tax cuts on rich and corporations and major corporations. And the justification for these tax cuts was, oh look, we have to do this to stay competitive. And if we give these tax cuts, then we're going to stimulate the economy, it's going to create jobs, you know, a rising tide lifts all boats, right? And that was not true. The tax cuts failed. What you have is corporations hoarding money, the rich getting richer, and then a government that throws its hands up in the air and goes, oh wait, we have no money to fund social programs. Well, why do you have no money to fund social programs? Because of a deliberate project to take money out of the state and transfer it to the rich and to major corporations. And this is not something that is exclusive to Quebec or to Canada. It's what I like to call the austerity agenda. People also call it neoliberalism. People call it a lot of different things. And it's also arguably the end stage of capitalism. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, capitalism sort of worked. People were still being exploited. There was still a small minority that was exploiting everybody else. But the fact of the matter was that most people were given enough to keep them happy. People had jobs, people had pensions, people had education for their kids. They could live a reasonably comfortable life. And I think what we're seeing these days is just greed taken to such an extreme extent that it's eating itself. And it's really impossible to see how such a system is going to be able to continue, because we're just pushing people and pushing people and pushing people. And I think right now, what we're starting to see, not just in Quebec, with the Occupy movement, with a lot of the mobilization in Latin America, in Europe, there's massive protests going on in Spain right now, is the start of what I hope can be a global movement to resist that austerity agenda. And I think it is really now or never. We've been farting around for a long time. And I don't know how many of you read Bill McKibben's article in Rolling Stone recently, but he put the climate situation very well. The amount of greenhouse gas, so basically the target that the world governments have set is to not allow global temperature to rise by more than 2 degrees. And if it does rise between 1 and 2 degrees, most of Africa will turn into a dust bowl and most of the island nations are going to sink, but some of us will still be alive. If it goes over 2%, pretty much all die. And the amount of carbon that can be burned while keeping temperature under 2 degrees is 565 gigatons. And the amount of carbon that would be released by burning all of the oil in the documented reserves of the major oil companies and oil-producing nations is about 2,500 gigatons. And if any meaningful action were taken on climate change that would actually prevent us from burning more than 565 gigatons, it would immediately overnight write down about $20 trillion worth of assets, which would tank the economy. So we're really at a make it or break it point in terms of the climate, in terms of people, in terms of all of these issues. And something that I always really appreciated about CLASSE was their analysis is much broader than other groups. They're not just fighting for their interests, they're not just fighting for student interests, they understand that it's part of a broader picture, and that we need to be engaged, not just fighting for education, but fighting for a different type of society. And if we don't make drastic changes to the way society works very quickly, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. So I guess that's about it. As I was saying about Kate, I'm still figuring out what I'm saying, so sorry if that sounded a little rambling. Again, the last thing I wanted to say before I turn it over, this tour, as I was mentioning, this is the first stop. We're going to be stopping in seven cities over the next 7 days. It's a whistle-stop tour. We're going all over the country, flying quickly and what have you with the three of us. As you can imagine, airline tickets for the three of us are expensive, and we're actually currently in deficit of about $2,000 just of the airline tickets without being able to pay for anything else. So we're gonna pass around some hats at the end, and any contributions you guys can make would be massively appreciated, because they'll help us keep doing this and going around the country. And in the unlikely event that we raise more money than we need, it will be donated to CLASSE. So I want to thank you all, and turn it over to Gabriel.
yeah, I'm gonna begin by the usual apologies. I'm a real unilingual Quebec Francophone student, and just to tell you a little story, I learned to speak English when I was elected as a spokesperson. So it has this curious consequence that I can talk pretty fluently about neoliberalism, but that I am pretty uncomfortable to order an hamburger in a restaurant. So I try to speak slowly and I try to be clear. So maybe to continue a little bit my personal presentation, my name is Gabriel Nadeau-Dubois. I am a student in history and philosophy in Université du Québec à Montréal. I'm a student activist for 6 years now, since my college. I'm really a child of the 2005 strike, and I was elected on April 2010 as the spokesperson of CLASSE, which at the time was a little student union, the third one in importance in Quebec. In the last months, we have become the first student organization in Quebec with more than 100,000 members, representing 70% of the students that were in strike in the last months in Quebec. So this puts us in this very particular situation where we are the bigger student union, but also the more militant, and we are pretty proud of that. This strike really has been a wonderful episode of politicization, and it opened the eyes of a lot of students in Quebec that decided to join our coalition. Thank you, obviously, for the invitation. It's always a pleasure, and I consider it a duty for us as Quebec students to go all over the country, even all around the world, to discuss and to share our experience. Because I think I can speak for the students of CLASSE to say that we are very proud of the victory that we have reached by being in strike, and we think it's our first duty to share our experience and to try to explain to students and workers all around Canada how we did. Because, like Ethan said, it has been a long process of 2 years of working to reach this level of mobilization. My colleague Cloé will go into further details about really how day-to-day we worked to construct that student organization, how we worked to mobilize and to put on strike so many students from all around our province. For my part, I will try to be a little bit more general in my speech, and I'll try to maybe explain a little bit what is our analysis as a student organization of the tuition increase. What is behind the tuition increase? Because obviously there's the official reasons why tuition has been raised in Quebec and in Canada historically, but I'll try to maybe share with you what we see underneath those projects. To give you an idea, the increase that was announced in Quebec by the Chapin government was an increase of 75%. It was an increase of 75%, $1,625 per year increase over 5 years. I want to begin by explaining a little bit the context in which this decision was announced. This tuition increase was announced in the 2010 budget by the Liberal government of Jean Charest. At the moment, the finance minister, which is called Raymond Bachand, described his budget two days before it was adopted as a cultural revolution. And it can be very funny to see that a Liberal minister uses this kind of expression to justify his measures, to say it's a cultural revolution. But I always found that very interesting, to see that the guy who is responsible for this increasing of tuition fees recognizes when he presents his budget that in fact it's not an economic decision, it is not a financial decision, it's a cultural decision, it's an ideological decision. And I find it very interesting to always say that this minister was saying, what I'm doing here with Quebec, with this budget, is a cultural revolution. Because in this budget, there was not only an increasing of tuition fees, there was also the first user fee measure in our health system in Quebec, which was called the taxe santé, health tax. The PQ government recently abolished this tax, but it was announced in the same budget that the increasing of tuition fees. And when Mr. Bachchan says it's a cultural revolution, what he means is very clear, and he was explaining it like that. The objective of his budget was to break the historical political culture of Quebec, which is to have tax-bearing public services financed by a tax scheme that is progressive and that asks every worker, every citizen to pay his fair share in the financing of the public services and of the state in general. So when Mr. Bachchan says candidly it's a cultural revolution, what he means is that this budget is about changing the political culture of Quebecers. It's about breaking this social democrat system based on redistribution of wealth, which is not a perfect system, obviously, but that still is able to control the difference between the rich and the poor. So to break this social democrat system and transform it into what we can call a more Anglo-Saxon model of privatization of the public services and user fees in the public services, as in education, health, and there are a lot of other examples. For us, this decision of increasing tuition fees has two major impacts, not only on students, but on society in general. And I'll try maybe to briefly explain what were those two big consequences, because those two themes have been really the two major issues on which we have been mobilizing since now maybe 3 years to be able to have this huge student strike. Well, the first impact of an increasing of tuition fees is very clear and it's known. It's an attack to accessibility to post-secondary education. Because unlike what is said in the mainstream media, the Quebec model of low tuition fees historically has had very clear impacts on accessibility to university for citizens and especially for the middle class. Quebec is the province in Canada where there is the more students from the middle class in programs like medicine, pharmacy, and engineering. It's also the province in Canada where you can find in the universities the more students from remote areas where there are no universities. And it's also the province in Canada where you have the more what we call first generation students. Les étudiants de première génération. First generation students are students that are the first of their family to ever go to university. And in Quebec, more than half of the students in universities are first generation students. And so that's clear impacts of our policy of low tuition fees on accessibility to education. Also, there is an institution that we're very proud of in the Quebec student movement, which is called the Sept. That is something very unique in Quebec. It doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. It's a mandatory, transitory, free college between high school and university, and those colleges are free. So the fact that we have very low tuition fees in universities and those free colleges, the combined effect of those two traditions in Quebec make that we have a post-secondary frequentation rate of 9% over the Canadian half. And in the media, when you hear columnists talk about our policy of low tuition fees, you will always hear them say, you know, Quebec has very low tuition fees, but their university frequentation rate is one of the lowest in the country. And then they logically conclude, so a policy of low tuition increase has no impact on accessibility to education. This way to think is wrong for two reasons. First, because it forgets the fact that we have those colleges called the Sept. And for example, in many provinces in Canada, if you want to become a nurse, you have to go to university and then pay tuition fees. If you want to become a nurse in Quebec, you only have to go to Sept, which is free, and you become a nurse. So the fact that those professions are taught in the Sept obviously makes that there are less students going to universities. But when you take the post-secondary frequentation rate, so you see, let's see in Quebec and in the rest of Canada, what is the proportion of students that will continue to go to school after high school, then we realize that because we have those CEGEP and those school tuition fees, we have a frequentation rate that is 9% above the Canadian average. And if we listen to the Liberals and reach the Canadian half of tuition fees, we will probably also reach the Canadian half of post-secondary frequentation. And that, for us, is not a good objective to pursue. The second reason why this reasoning to say if you raise tuition fees, there's no impact on accessibility is because, for example, in programs like medicine in Quebec, our universities accept approximately 1 student out of 4 that apply to the programs of medicine. So even if we decided to triple tuition fees, the medicine faculty would still be full. There will still be the same amount of students having a medicine diploma. And then the right wing could say, you see, there's no impact on accessibility because they're the same number of students going out of the universities. The problem is that in those programs that are very difficult to access, yes, there will be the same number of diplomas, but the students having their diplomas won't be the same. They won't come from the same families, they won't come from the same neighborhood, they won't come from the same socioeconomic background. So the first impact of an increasing of tuition fee is not to make that there will be less people in the university. I mean, we could multiply by 10 tuition fees, and universities won't be empty. I mean, there will still be people in the medicine class. But the fact is that those people won't be the same. They will come from rich families and not from middle class families or worker families. So that's the very brief overview I can do about our argument about the impact of tuition fees on accessibility to university. The second theme of our mobilization in the last months and the last years in Quebec has been to try to make the students understand that this tuition has to be understood in a much larger context, a much larger tendency to the privatization of post-secondary education. In French, we say marchandisation, which comes from marchandise. In English, you would say commodification of education and of universities. It's a very complex thing to talk about. I won't have the time, obviously, to go all through it, but I'll try to, once again, do a brief overview. Like Ethan explained a little bit, since the hand of Fordism, the global economy has changed a lot. Capitalism has changed a lot. As we all know, the economies of the North, just like the Canadian or the Quebec economy, do not function anymore on manufacturing things. The majority of very concrete work to make, objects have been displaced in Asian countries, or more generally, South countries. So the economies of the developed countries are more and more what we call in French an économie du savoir, a knowledge economy. An economy that is not based on creating objects, but that is based on developing ideas. Developing ideas and obviously putting the hand on it to be sure that the money that will be made in the South by exploiting this idea will come back to us. So briefly we can say it's an economy of creation and conception. We create things, we think things, and then they are manufactured elsewhere in the world. So profit doesn't lie anymore in making things. It lies now in developing ideas. But the problem with research and development, because that's what we're talking about, the problem with research and development is that it's very, very expensive. And there are a lot of risks to research and development for private corporations, because you need to put millions and millions of dollars in order to try to find something. And if you don't find it, well, you lose the money. So that's why since maybe the 80s, we have seen the private corporations trying to find a way to make research and development without having to bear the risk of it. And then appears this institution where you have hundreds, thousands of students, intelligent people, massively funded by public money that are supposed to be in those institutions to exactly do that. Develop new knowledge, develop new ideas. So that's why big corporations quickly saw in the university the perfect institution for them to make research and development without bearing the risk of it, and making sure that the ideas and technologies that will be developed in the universities will be funded by public money, but that the profit will come back into their hands. And this is why, and this is like the root of this dynamic of privatization of post-secondary education. So what happened, very briefly, is that corporations turn to an institution that is called university, that is funded by public money, and that will be ready to make those research and this development at a much cheaper price. So more than ever today, and more than ever in their history, universities are being placed in the very heart of capitalism. And that's why you will never hear a right-wing party saying that education and universities are not important. They will, in Quebec, it's fascinating to see how the
Chamber of Commerce.
The big Chamber of Commerce, the right-wing parties, the big businessmen, they all agree on one thing. Education is the future of Quebec. But in fact, when they talk about the future of Quebec, they talk about the future of the economy. They don't talk about the future of society. And when they talk about economy, obviously we know what they mean. When they talk about economy, they talk about their own company. So in brief, for capitalism, universities are probably, like Ethan said, their last hope for, is probably capitalism's last hope for survival. Because it's probably one of the last places where they could develop those technologies without having to bear this unbelievable pressure and risk on an economic level. So the plan of the 1% is not to say that education is not important. The plan of the 1% is the opposite, to put universities in really the core of the new global capitalism. But if you want to put universities in the center of capitalism, you have to change some things that don't fit in capitalism, that historically are part of this institution that is called university. First, you have to, I think we can say you have to go by 2 steps. First, you have to privatize the funding of the universities. Because if the funding is still, if the funding is as the way it is now, your universities will be reluctant to really totally enter into global capitalism. And you have also to privatize the activities of the universities. You have to change what the universities do. Because if they keep on thinking about the relation between Foucault and Deleuze, it's not good. You have to change what the people actually do in universities. And what is wonderful for the right wing with the tuition increase is that it does both. Tuition increase does 2 things. It privatizes the funding of the university, and it contributes to changing activities of the universities. So first, I think the first thing is very simple. When you increase tuition fees, you privatize the funding of universities. Because what has been observed everywhere in the world is that, contrary to what is said by the media and by the people who want to increase tuition fees, when tuition fees increase, for example, by 75%, the public funding of universities is reduced from 75%. That's what happened in 1990 in Quebec when the tuition fees were increased. And it's what happened in England also. It's what happened everywhere when the tuition fees increased. They say universities are underfinanced, we have to put more money in it. But in fact, what they do is not put more money in it. They just change the place from where the money comes from. But in fact, there is the same amount of money in the university. So when you increase tuition fees, you privatize its funding. It's very simple. So you pass from a university that is funded publicly by taxes to a university that is funded by individuals and also by philanthropy, which is this new thing saying that, yeah, we will also ask the corporations to do their part in the funding of education. We will open this foundation and where the corporations will be able to give money. But obviously, when corporations give money voluntarily, it's not because they think that the history of art should be taught very seriously. They do it because they see an interest, an immediate interest in funding. So they will obviously fund the universities for certain things in certain programs. And even in Quebec, what we are beginning to see, and I guess that it's already the case here, we are seeing corporations giving money to specific teachers in specific classrooms for specific courses. Because they know that if this program and this curriculum is rightly funded, we will profit from it. So that's the first thing. But when you and here you see the second way why tuition increase changes the activities of the universities, because so we already said it privatizes the funding, but it also privatizes the activities, because the new funding that is generated by the private sector will be directed into certain sectors of the university more than others. But when you increase tuition, you also change the very nature of university, his very mission. Because when you increase tuition, the first impact, even before the impact on accessibility, is an impact on indebtedness. It's really a terrible word in English, endettement, the fact that students have debt. And how can I say, that is a very efficient disciplinary process for students. When you know that as a student going to university will have as consequence that you will have a $40,000 debt, well, you will be very careful in choosing the good university and the good program. So when you increase tuition fees, you naturally say to the students that they have to shop their education. And even if you are a very generous person, a very left-wing activist, if you know that by going to university, you're going to have this huge debt, naturally, it's going to be a reflex. You're going to begin as young as 16 or 17 years old to think your own education as an economic investment. So when you create student debt, what do? Well, you are able to put in the head of a very young adult, beginning his life, the idea that public institutions are there for him, for his personal and financial interests. So you are not only able, when you increase tuition fees, to change the university, but you are also able to change the nature of the relation between the student and the institution, between the student and his own education. Because you put in his head that choose a good program and choose a good university, because if you don't, you will have a huge debt and you won't be able to pay for it after. So when you are in front, as a student, of that kind of dilemma, obviously philosophy, literature, fine arts seems suddenly a lot less interesting. But engineering, medicine, and all those very applied science will suddenly look very interesting. So when you increase tuition, like I said, you are able to modify the relation that the student, the very young student from 16 or 17 years old, will have to his own education. And one of the big arguments that was used by the Liberal government to justify the tuition increase was that education is an investment on your future. In French, they say c'est un investissement sur votre capital humain. It's an investment on your human capital, your own little, capital. And when you increase tuition fees, the prophecy realizes itself. Because when you increase tuition fees, you will actually succeed to make the students think like that. So that's where you change the relation, like I said, between the students and in the institution, and consequently also between the student and the teacher, the student, and society itself. When you convince a 17 or 18-year-old student that education is a commodity, well, you are sure now that he is totally ready to be part of the capitalist world of work and credit. If you put youth into debt, you create an obedient. So I always talk too much, so I will end fast now, but briefly, let's say that the process of privatizing the universities, in the process of privatizing the university, the economic elite has to obviously, like I said, change the funding of universities from a public funding to a private, philanthropic, and individual funding. They have also to change the activities of the universities from teaching activities to, from teaching and fundamental research to commercial research. You'll change also the programs that the student, the choice of programs of the students, and you will change the students, you will change how they see their own education. And if you want to transform education into, if you want to transform universities into enterprises, well, you have to make sure that everyone in the university is on the same way, that everyone in the university understands that now they are working in a private enterprise. And tuition increase do those three things. And that's why it is so important. And I tend to think that the proof that we're right in this analysis is the fact that it has been impossible for us to make the liberals go back on their decision of increasing tuition fees. In 2005, it was about a changement in the bursaries and loan system. They were trying, to take, they wanted to save $103 million, And when you read the budget in 2005, it wasn't
like a footnote.
a footnote. It was a footnote in the budget. For them, at that time, it was really a financial decision. What we have realized this year in Quebec is that, at the opposite, the decision of increasing tuition fees, it was not in the footnote of the budget. It was the main measure of the budget. They had an unbelievable numbers of strategic communication experts working for them in order to make sure that this measure would be approved. They did videos, they did website, and in 2005 we did an 8-week strike, and they went back totally. They said, okay, we get back the money. It was, let's say, easy compared to this year. This year we did, I don't know how many weeks, like 20, 25, I don't know, and 6 months of strike, and they never went back. They preferred to apply a totally unconstitutional law than to go back in there. They preferred to start an election a year and a half before they were supposed to do it because they wanted to increase tuition fees. Why is the elite so obsessed with this idea? Why does the liberals have been totally incapable of going back on that decision? Even when, and I can say because I was there, even when we were negotiating with the ministers in Quebec, we found a solution for them that's okay. We found a trick in the budget to say that they will not raise tuition, that they will not put one more money in education, and since universities will have the same budget. And even there, they refused our deal. So that's I think that proves the ideological importance of the tuition increase and the ideological importance of privatizing universities for the survival of capitalism. And that's why I honestly think that if we want to develop a strategy to worldwidely begin to beat the austerity agenda, I think the student movements, not only in Quebec and Canada, in Chile, but all around the world, will have to be at the very front of it. I think students have now the responsibility to be the first in the streets against this complete disaster that is global capitalism. Because as students and as teachers, and I see a lot of teachers in the classrooms, we are the last, the last
Bastion.
the last inheritance we inherit from this institution that is called university, that was once invented to make sure that society as a way, as a place where it can discuss itself. An institution that should be the source of critical thinking and of freedom. And it's not a detail if now, when the economic system is in crisis, the elite is attacking this institution first. It's because education and universities historically have been, I think, and maybe I say that because I'm a student, but I think those institutions, and I think education in general, have been probably the first source of our collective freedom.
Okay, so hi, I'm Chloe. I probably need a little more introduction than my two colleagues here need. I'm a student in political science at Université du Québec à Montréal, also known as UQAM. And I've been involved in the student movement now for 4 years. At first, I was involved in my local student union in political science. And since, I can say it's been a year now that I've been involved in the national student movement. So my part of the presentation is going to be a little more concrete and a little more focused on how precisely we built the movement this past winter and spring. So first, I'm going to start talking about how it all started. To understand the construction of the movement from this past winter and spring, we have to go back to April 2010, when the budget of Mr. Bachchan was announced. At the time, so it's been 2 years now, and at the time, the student movement was one of the first, let's say, the first organizations that decided to mobilize against the budget for the student movements. And so at the time, we organized a big protest in which participated not only student organizations, but also community groups and a lot of people from the unions united against the austerity budget. And that's how it all started 2 years ago. And from then, the student movement did a lot of information and mobilization campaigns all over Quebec, in the CEGEPs, and in the universities. So as Ethan said earlier, the student strike of the spring didn't just explode spontaneously when the semester began. So there are two main factors that can explain how we achieved this past winter. And to me, these two factors are the structure of the movement and the democratic culture of the student movement in Quebec, which is a little bit more different than what we have here in the English provinces of Quebec. And we often think that it's a hard thing to reconciliate a massive organization such as the CLASSE with solid, rigid structures that involve a certain form of centralization and a culture of real direct democracy where the decisions are made are truly made as a result of a collective discussions and debates between the members of the organization. So yeah, but in fact, what we realized this spring is that these two elements, the structure and the democracy, are the two elements that brought us where we are today. So first, before I explain the structure, I'll explain briefly the structure of the Quebec student movement. But before I have to explain to you a little bit of the education system that's a little bit different in Quebec from what we have here in the rest of Canada. So in Quebec, of course, you have the elementary school and then the high school. And then, as Gabriel said earlier, you have the CEGEP, which is either a 2-year program, which is a pre-university program, or you have a professional program, which is normally 3 years. And after, of course, you have the university. So, as for the student movement structure, it's very similar in Quebec to the labor movement structure. So in each college or CEGEP, you have one student union that represents all of the students of the CEGEP. So in the CEGEP, you can have from a few hundreds to a few thousands of students. Usually it's about from 2,000 to 5,000 people. And the universities, the structure is a little bit more different. And it's a little bit more complicated also because it varies from one university to another. But to make it simple, let's say that students are either represented by their department student union or by their faculty student union. And so, yeah. So these student unions are what we call in Quebec the local student unions, and that are most of the time resembled under a national student organization such as a CLASSE. There are 3 main national student organizations in Quebec, which are the CLASSE, the FEC. Well, in the CLASSE you have both CEGEP's unions and university unions, and then you have the FEC, which is only like CEGEP's unions, and the FERC, which is only university unions. So that's for the structure of the student movement in Quebec. Now the important thing that we have to understand is how the way that the movement works on the inside, because that's what's particular in Quebec. And what's particular is that it's very democratic, but also it has a certain form of centralization. So how it works is that every local student union makes their decisions in some general assemblies that you have. Usually you have once or twice a semester, you have a general assembly in every local student union. During the strike, of course, we had a general assembly every week because then the decisions that are made in the local student unions in the general assemblies are taken to a congress, which is the national instance. Can you see that?
The national decision making.
The national decision-making place. And so usually, yeah, we have one congress like once or twice a semester, but during the strike it was every week, so we had to do general assemblies every week. So in every congress you have delegates from every student unions from all over Quebec. So you have delegates, 1 to 3 normally delegates from every student unions of every union. And so the people in the CEGEPs and in the universities are used to being involved in the process of decision making, because they are always the ones that are first bringing the proposals in their general assemblies that are then debated between the members of the local unions and then brought to the Congress by the delegates and then debated between the different student unions in the Congress, and that's how we make decisions on a national level. So that's how we think that in Quebec we succeeded when we had a so strong movement because people, as Ethan was saying earlier, are really feel that they're part of the movement, that are really involved in it and in the process of the decision making and everything. And so that's where we think that the heart of the movement is really the democratic culture. Then the difference between how it works in Quebec and maybe how it works in other organizations throughout Canada is that we have bigger organizations which, as I said earlier, have a certain form of centralizations. And here maybe we're more used to having smaller organizations with democratic cultures, and that's a big difference between Quebec and the rest of Canada, because I'm sorry, I'm a little confused. And I can. Yeah, so I can say that that's one of the big differences between the Quebec student movement and the Canada student movement, because it exists also here, but the difference is more structural. And so now as for the mobilization process, at first we started, because the Quebec student movement is known for having some pretty radical demands compared to what we're used in the rest of the provinces maybe. But we have to understand that at first we started by having like one main demand that was known by every student in the movement, which was blocking the hike. It was only one demand, but of course the people in the organizations were knew that it wasn't like an isolated measure, and knew that it was part of a much broader context, like the neoliberal context that we talked about earlier. But then, as the movement went on and as the strike went on, we could go a little deeper in the discourse, and having debates in the General Assemblies and everything, started to be more conscious of the broader context of the mobilization. But at first we had to focus on one specific demand, and then we could go in a broad discourse. And I think I'll finish on that. Thank you.
So if you guys have questions, I think we have till 2 o'clock, so we still got half an hour to answer the questions on structural issues, mobilization, everything.
Bernie, do you want to see the questions?
I will, and you have one right here.
I saw you on TV. You were just out of court, so can you explain to the meeting here what's happening with your court case in Quebec, and
Maybe to explain a little bit.
and why you were taken to court?
First thing, Quebec has a long history of student strike, but none have ever been that long. We're talking about 6 months of non-stop student strike. And one of the important concepts of the Quebec student strike is that it's, and I will do the precision because sometimes there's a misunderstanding, they are actual strikes and not boycotts. So the decision to go on strike is not a decision that is taken individually by each student. Like Cloé explained, the decisions are taken in General Assemblies. And when the decision is taken by one General Assembly, well, for example, we were in political science in Université de Montréal. If the General Assembly of Political Science in Université de Montréal decides to go on strike, the strike applies to everyone. Even if you voted against, even if you missed the assembly, you were aware that there was an assembly, and when the collective decision is taken to go on strike, well, it applies to everyone. And it's a very, in fact, it's a strike just as in a labor union, even if a worker votes against the strike, it's beyond strike. It's the same thing in Quebec. So when the strike is voted, it applies to everyone. At the beginning of the strike, the administrations of the CEGEP and universities were recognizing immediately the decisions. For example, the strike vote was taken, the president of the local union was going to the principal and saying, here's the minutes of the assembly, we have a strike mandate, it's adopted according to the law, so we're on strike. And normally the principal says, okay, so there's not going to be, there's no course that are going to be given to the department, the faculty, or the part of the university or CEGEP. That isn't a strike. That was in the beginning of the strike, but the strike lasts more and more, 6, 7, 8, 10 weeks. And then we have to understand that a strike, a student strike, is efficient when it is long because it puts pressure on the semesters. Universities and CEGEPs are full in Quebec. So if the strike goes on and on for weeks and weeks and weeks, it begins to be more and more difficult as a CEGEP or a university to make sure that the students that are in strike will complete their semester. So obviously what people could conclude, well, they will just cancel the semester. But the problem is that if you cancel the semesters, at the next semester, you will have like twice the students you're supposed to have. So you're not going to build more universities and CEGEP to put them in. So this threat of canceling the semester is the student weapon and not the administration weapon. So I just want to explain the context because at the beginning, the principals were recognizing our votes. The strike was voted, there was no courses, and universities and CEGEPs were still accessible for students if they wanted to go to the library, to the gymnasium, workers, technicians, and teachers could still go in their office to do their work. No course were given. But since the pressure after 10 weeks, 12 weeks, 15 weeks was so strong on the administration, then they decided just to say, well, we will stop recognizing the votes. The course will be given, we don't give a fuck about the votes. But the problem is that after 15 weeks of strike, and our General Assemblies generally are very, very populous, students won't just accept that the administration stop recognizing their democratic decision. So that's when we decided to begin to hold picket lines in front of our campuses to say, well, if you don't want to recognize our collective decision, we are forced to make sure that our collective decision will be respected. Because if you let students go to class, you disadvantage the student who is in solidarity with the decision. Because the courses are going to be given, people are going to be disadvantaged. So then we began, and that's where this big thing about intimidation began. Because we just said, we're going to hold picket lines in front of every institution who has taken a vote. It's going to be like that. If you want to go to course, well, you go to the assembly and you vote against the strike. That's your right. When the collective decision is taken, it's taken, and there's no scabs in the student movement, just like there's no scabs in the union movement. But then the reaction of the students that were against the strike, that were called the Green Squares, that were organizing through the social media funded by the Liberal Party in Quebec, they decided to add this coordinated legal strategy to add injunction in front of the court to say education, and their argument was wonderful because education is a right. And if there are union activists, you know, it's exactly the same argument as the famously right to work. That was the major argument of the people that were opposing the unionization of the workers. It's the same argument. Work is a right, so there should be no strike. And it was the same thing. Education is an individual right. I have the individual right to have the service for which I pay, so I can go to my course. And the judges recognize that, and they start to deliver injunctions to whoever students want to do his course. Then we had a very difficult second decision. Are we going to respect those injunctions that are clearly going to destroy our strikes? Or are we going to disobey them? And that was a very big decision for the organization, and obviously also personally as a spokesperson. And in unanimity, in fact, student associations decided to continue to take advice and to don't listen to the courts. And the Congress of CLASSE voted them. And then I had to do interviews to defend that position, which could possibly be interpreted as an attempt to court, as an advice to do not respect the authority of the court. So there was this one interview at television where I said that I think when collective decisions are taken on campuses, they should be respected. And if we need picket lines to make sure that the votes are respected, I think it's a legitimate way to make the collective decision respected. I remember my words because I think for them. And so there was this reaction by the court to sue me for attempt to court, and by some of the students who had demanded those injunctions. In fact, there was one specific student that decided to sue me because he says that I have called people to break this injunction. So I was in court yesterday and the day before, and his objective, and he's going in the media saying that, is to put me in jail. At the worst, I could have 1 year of jail, but obviously the objective is to have none. But it's a little bit the history of how, when when the strike was so long, legal reactions were used by the elite, by the power to try to break our movement because they were in total panic. And it's only after that those injunctions failed everywhere. To give you an idea, there was one injunction that was successful. It was for one guy and one course in one university. In all the rest of Quebec, all the injunctions were broken. So it is after that that the Liberals decided to adopt the special law, the project of Law 78, that now is called Law 12, because the injunctions were missing.
So it's a very general question. There's a group of us in London, a bunch of us who are interested in bringing the student movement here. We're kind of in the beginning stages. We had a general assembly here last weekend. It was for the social justice club, something separate. But I mean, we're trying to bring just new ways of doing things here. The other day I started a Facebook page for something, hoping that turned really big. It's called Students Against Austerity, hoping to turn it into an education campaign about austerity measures, particular emphasis on student issues. Like I said, it's just like things, we're in the beginning stages here, and hoping people get on board with that. This is just a general question, do you have any advice for us at this stage for this is very, very beginning stages, any advice as to where to take it from here, anything we should know at this stage?
Well, as I said in the presentation briefly, to really start a student union, one of the things that is the most important is to have a general assembly. It's a good start. And then maybe you can think about, I don't know, it's the exercise demands that you collectively decide in your general assembly with your people, and then together you not only decide what the demands are going to be, but you also decide how you're going to achieve the goals together. Is it by doing some protests? Is it by doing some teaching? Is it by doing some specific workshops? And that's how you build your movement. And it's important to have some, small goals at the first that you can achieve by doing some specific projects, and then people start to be more familiar about, with the way this new union works, and start to get involved more, and that's how you build a movement.
I think maybe, what Cloé says is really right. You have to be able to win. If you win something, then you will say, we won. Our main argument this year was like, last time strike attacked us, we did an 8-week strike, we won. So let's do the same thing, and let's go again. Finally, it was a lot more complicated than that, but when you are able to prove that you can win, then you will come and speak to follow.
You have to make people understand that that what you're doing is gonna work if you want them to get involved in the movement.
And if you track them by saying, we're gonna start a group against austerity, and our demand is to end austerity. It's gonna probably be long before you reach that perspective. Right? So that's why you have to be able to say, okay, for example, I remember in Sept, we had this campaign against the monopoly that had Coca-Cola in our institution. It's very simple, very simple. We won it. And then we did another thing during the morning. And it's very important to have very precise goals. The important thing, because I want to really be clear with my idea, is not to say we're going to have a very precise demand and we are not going to put it in a much larger context. Because if you fall in the trap of being too pragmatic and too realistic, you will block the perspectives from the movement to grow larger. Our slogan in Quebec was Ensemble, bloquons la hausse. Together, stop the hype. Not very poetic, but very clear. It was let's stop the hype. But the discourse that was surrounding this very clear slogan was much more generous and much more large. Stop the hype because, and then we have those more systemic preoccupations. You have to do it step by step.
And just to finish, that's why the information campaigns and the mobilization campaigns are so important. Because on a poster or on Facebook, you can't, really explain the discourse that surrounds your specific demands. To do that, you really have to go talk to people in the cafeterias, in the classrooms during, the courses. Knock on the door, and you do your 5-minute speech. Go directly speak to people in the universities. That's how you make them think.
I think the major trap for our generation as activists is to be seducted by social media. We have to remember that yes, social medias can be helpful, but they are also a product of capitalism and technological advancement. So they clearly can be a way to communicate, but they also can be, and I think are, a way to alienate the village. And the social medias in our strike have been useful, but they have been useful when the strike was already going. You don't mobilize people in front of the screen. You will never do it, because going on strike is not easy. It means huge sacrifice. It means less money in your pocket. It means we don't say it in Quebec, but we can say it. It means obviously academic consequences. And people won't do those sacrifices if they're not deeply convinced that they're doing right. And you won't convince them like that by doing it. And Facebook is a good way to do it. But it will not convince people. When we started mobilizing in 2009, 2010 against the budget, we were clearly in minority on all the campuses. The majority of the students were in favor of tuition increase. I did them all. They were all.
Even a year ago.
We were maybe 10, 15%. And we convince one student at a time by talking to them, by going up each morning at 7 a.m. distributing flyers, print paper. That's something that, you know, we ecology, I want to see the planet too, but you know, if education is destroyed, we won't have that much sense to see the planet. So print hundreds of papers, thousands. I give you an example. In the 2 months before the strike, the printer of the Association of Human Sciences in my university printed, is it 1 million copies? Something like that. Like unbelievable, an unbelievable amount of flyers, newspaper, posters that were distributed each morning for years. And that's how it worked. And it's very blood, sweat, and tears. There's nothing else.
Just to clarify, the whole Facebook thing wasn't like,
I don't know.
yeah, I didn't.
Yeah, I know, but
It doesn't sound like it's like
when
a
the
deal.
strike was already on, you know, when everyone was in strike, social medias were very useful.
Yeah, that was the
People
point,
that strike
just to get my thoughts.
spontaneously organized things.
It lets you know there's a protest happening. That's what it's really good for,
Yeah.
right? And you didn't know there was a protest. Oh, hey, there's a protest. We can't go there. But it never convinces anyone that they should go into protest.
Unless they're convinced it's useful to reach them.
Yeah.
Because you have to-
Of course, it was just kind of a place to start.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that. Try to get later. Move on to another question. Back to Bill.
Wondering if, specifically for the austerity agenda, and you're working on the education part, but I'm sure you must have had other groups who are more concerned about the whole broad agenda. I'm part of the Council of Canadians right now. There's a group of a couple of different chapters getting together about talking about trade right now in the city. And we're trying to branch out, and we're trying to meet and to communicate with as many groups as possible. So are there any Quebec groups that are very much concerned about the whole broad agenda, as well as yourself, that we would be able to get in contact with, that we could actually see if we could develop a cross-border grouping that way, that we could actually build on that and some other aspects of the austerity agenda?
Well, what I was talking about earlier is that in 2010, when the budget was announced, a coalition of student unions, labor unions, and community groups was founded, and it's called la coalition opposée à la tarification et la privatisation des services publics. The coalition opposed to privatization of public services. And so that specific coalition has many demands about like this, the education system, of course, but also like the health system and
The demand, because the budget of the last time was containing three major things: the increase in tuition fees, the health tax, and a major increase of the price of electricity, because it's
it's nationalized.
So inside this coalition, there is 125 groups: unions, women groups, student groups, ecological groups, and it's probably the place where all the social movements in Quebec converge together and adopt common action plans. They did it since the election of the Jebachan, and it's probably the best door on which you could knock to try to make links, because in this coalition you have basically all the social movements in Quebec that work together in a coordinated strategy.
Do you have contact information?
The website is very simple. It's no like no increases, noos.com. Then you have the list of the groups, and you also have the contacts of you have the email of the group. If you come, see me after that.
Okay.
I have a question. Being a philosophy student yourself, the way you're speaking evoked an idea by a philosopher, Alain Badiou, who you might be familiar with. He makes a distinction, a really interesting one, between an immediate strike and an historical strike, where the difference between an immediate situation is one that is a flare-up in response to a government action, whereas an historical strike or riot is something like we saw in the spring, where there's a horizon to a new politics or a new idea. One of the things that I'm interested in, it does link around to the previous question, is what were some of the actions you took to make sure that it wasn't a 3 or 4 or 5 day action to a 6-month action? How did you build relationships to faculty? How did you interact with the media? How did you organize it such that it broke from something that would just be a flare-up and something that would take a long time and have that kind of solidarity? Because I think that's something that in Ontario or across Canada is something that's a difference, is that infrastructure might not be there as well as it's set in place in Quebec. And that transition, I think, is one of the key things that, especially on our campus here, we have great faculty like Bernie Hammond, who is amazing at making the links between labor, between undergrad students, but I can speak from main campus, we don't have as many links like that. And I'm amazed and in admiration of what you guys have done.
The first thing I want to say is that mobilization is not a science. So there's a lot of things that you cannot control. There is conjunctures, forces, influences that come and go that you will never control. And we have to admit that in Quebec, we have been lucky to have a 9-year terrible government before we went on strike. This government was already being attacked by unbelievable scandal of corruption. So it helped us because, and in the year before we started our strike, the government had already backed down on 2 major things: on the exploitation of okay? And on the corruption issue. There was a huge demand of having a public commission, and the government refused it for 2 years and then accepted it to do it. So we had a weak government that was just backing down from 2 major issues. And so our opponent was already, that's something, that's the context that you never control. So, and it has a big part of the fact that we have been able. But we also, I think we also did things very concrete to be sure that the movement would grow. The first thing is this idea of escalation of pressure. We began mobilizing 2 years ago, and obviously, the day after the budget, we were not saying, let's go in a 25-week strike. No, we began by saying, okay, that is the budget, that's why we're against, and we have a petition. And you know, as the more radical organization, we were like, petition, you know. But you got to begin by that always. And then we did petitions, and then we did symbolic actions. We did some meetings, we did some teaching, workshops. Yeah, we went to the summit that the government organized to consult us. Obviously, it was bullshit. We went and we said, yeah, let's be consulted. We knew it was bullshit. We went, and then we went back to the students saying, you know, we did that. We went to this consultation. Didn't work. And then we arrived in November, last November, 2011, where after a year and a half of one-day strikes, of protests, petitions, things like that, we said, okay, let's do a coordinated one-day strike with all the student organizations in Quebec, and let's do one big protest in Montreal, and let's go into the assemblies and say to the students, we're asking you a mandate for a one-day strike, but be aware that this one-day strike is the last step before an open-ended general strike. And we said very clearly, if you vote in favor of that one-day strike, take it as a vote also for the next step, which is a non-limited general strike. So everyone knew when we came back in February, everyone knew that not only that there was a tuition increase, but they all had did one-day strike, and they all knew that they were going to be consulted in something much more big. Nobody was surprised because we did 2 years to go up in escalation. So when the first General Assemblies were called to start the strike, no one was surprised. They were like, yeah, we know we're going to go. And the assemblies were huge, but huge. And then the strike began. Obviously, you begin by your stronger campuses, make them go on strike, and then progressively more and more campuses are on strike. So that's for the student part of the mobilization. The second part of the question was, how did we managed to have like this convergence of the social movements and those links with other organizations. You know, on this issue again, I think one of the main reasons is the structure. We had CLASSE, but we had also a coalition called, well, Cloé talked about it, the Coalition Against the Privatization of Public Services, also called the Coalition Red N, because its logo is a red N. And the Red N Coalition was mobilizing with us since day one, since 2010, in working factories, in the streets, in the metros, in the supermarkets, saying there's a terrible budget, there's an attack against scientific education, and all those thousands of activists, even if they were in women groups, in ecological groups, in labor unions, we had this meeting in the coalition where we said, okay, this year, our common action plan and our common objective is the tuition increase. And obviously they all do their own campaigns. Everyone was targeting the same thing. Next year, it will probably be the electricity and student movement engineers. And it's this idea of having a structure that permits all the groups here around the same table give a common objective going the same way. And not only solidarity in the air, not only beautiful speeches, but the fact that workers, students, nurses, women groups, ecological militants, they were all ending out the same flag. That's the type of convergence we're really using the same way, doing common protests. You know, the first action of the strike, 3 days at the beginning of the strike, we decided to block the entrance of the Montreal Stock Exchange. And we blocked it for, I think, 4 or 5 hours. We were 2,000, at the time we found that impressive. We were 2,000, and I mean, probably 75% of the protesters were not students. They were workers, they were women, they were people from the community. And we all blocked Stock Exchange together. So then, in the head of the student, it was very clear that it was not only their fight, and in the head of the other protesters, they were receiving, they were hit by the police for accessibility to education. So it also put them like in the movement in a very concrete way, not only in ideas, but they were in the streets, they were on the picket lines, they were hidden like we were hidden, they were gassed like we were gassed. So, you know, that's where real solidarity lives.
And it's actually a really important point, because what's so critical for people to understand is that we all have the same enemy, right? And for too long, it's like, okay, I'm in the environmental movement, so I'm concerned about the environment, and I kind of ignore other things because they're not really my main cause. Maybe I care about them, but I kind of ignore them, right? And we're all off in our little bubbles, and never the twain shall meet. And what's so important to understand is that the cause of the problems that people are fighting in the environmental movement is the same cause that people are fighting in the labor movement, is the same cause that people are fighting in the student movement. And the only way that we can effectively challenge this broken system is by really working together to a much higher degree than we have been able to up till now. And that's something that was really exciting to see in Quebec.
Not only in meetings, it means that all groups and all movements have to be able to do compromises. You know? That maybe this year is not going to be my cause. That maybe this year is the tuition increase, and maybe next year is the average pipeline, and maybe the year after is it's abortion. But you need, and that's probably the main challenge, especially for labor unions and the environmental movement, to be able to say that maybe this year we're not a priority. But it's a difficult thing to say, I think, for a lot of activists and groups. But it's the kind of compromise that we have to do if we want to get strong. Because the right wing is really methodical, you know. They don't, like, you know, Shanghai didn't raise tuition fees and did 100 things at the same time. They're going thing by thing, destroying our society. I think we should respond to each other attack one after the other.
Right? There's 2 at the back, maybe start at the very back and then the head.
I guess first, if you could just say something about this expression social strike and how that's understood in Quebec, just because
it's not a term that's necessarily used in Ontario much, and if you could shed light on that, that would be great. And then secondly, a simple procedural question. Are all of the General Assemblies in different campuses organized by official student union structures, or are some of them organized independently and maybe against the wishes of official student union structures?
I begin on the social strike, so we will end up on the General Assemblies. This idea, this project of social strike is what we didn't reach that this year in Quebec. It was one of the objectives at the end of the movement. The idea of social strike is to have a general strike in all sectors, or let's say in a lot of sectors at the same time. So not only students, but students, public workers, certain sectors of the private sectors. Something that is seen some few times in France. It's an idea that is in the head of a lot of the social movements in Quebec since a few years. We were not able to achieve it. And it's more than often it's a political strike. So it's a strike that everyone does on the with a political objective. So not on the issue of bargaining of a collective agreement, but really a strike of all workers, of all sectors, and students on a political issue. That's this idea of social strike. We did some in Greece, we did some in Spain and France. We were not able to do it this year in Quebec. And the major reason why it's very difficult to do is that I don't know if it's the same thing in Canada, probably, but in Quebec, it's the unions cannot go on strike if it's not for the negotiation, for the bargaining of their collective agreement. They have the right to go on strike, but in a very small window between two collective agreements. They cannot go on strike for against the health tax, because as workers they think it's a bad idea. And that's a big problem for the labor movement, because it puts handcuffs on them to say that they cannot go on strike for political reasons. And that's probably the main reason why we were unable to have this social strike. But let's say that it was probably in the history of Quebec the first or the second time that we were that close from having a social strike. Like, some unions were seriously discussing it. Some unions voted it, like some little union, but it never really came reality. Because obviously, one union will not do a social strike. The consequences are too big. A social strike will happen if there is a convergence of a critical number of unions.
If it's illegal, of course, and very severely punished, like financially. So on the question about the General Assemblies, the General Assemblies are most of the time, almost always organized by the people on the executive councils of the student unions. What I was saying earlier is that what's particular in the student movement is that it's on one hand very democratic, working by the decisions are always made by the General Assemblies, but at the same time there is a certain form of centralization. Meaning that in every local student union you have an executive council with about, I would say, 10 people that are making sure that the decisions that are made by all of the members in the General Assembly are really, applied. And that the mandates that the members in the General Assembly's vote are really, become reality. And that's the main role of the people on the Executive Council. They're not there to make decisions. They're not there to impose their vision of the union. Of course, they can have some strategic reflections, and that's very important too. But there's not at any time they can, impose their vision on the members. The decisions are always made by the people in the General Assemblies, but these General Assemblies are always organized by the people of the Executive Council.
And that's a very important key, because if it's not an official student union that votes the strike, it won't be recognized by the administration, and that's it's very important, and that's why we are so powerful, because our associations are legally recognized by the administration and by the law, by the government. We are officially recognized as the representative of all the students in Quebec.
And when we say organize, that means that they have to be there to frame the debate in a sort of not to influence the debate, like the content of the debate, but be there to make sure that there's a facilitator in front that's very impartial and that the people in the General Assembly really feel that they can express their opinions in a free way and that the debate goes well so that the democracy is respected, basically.
Was there never any sort of Liberal Party supporting the executives that refused to hold those meetings? Did it never happen that there was Liberal Party supporters who didn't want to hold the General Assemblies or anything like that?
You know, in the Quebec student movement, the RAND formula applies. That means that all the students are automatically mandatory members of their association and they pay their fees. The university takes the money and gives it to the student association. So even if you're a Liberal Party supporter, you are still a member of your association. And that gives you the right and the power to go in your General Assembly and vote against the strike. And the decision in General Assembly, and that's a crucial thing, are taken by majority, not by consensus. Because you know, you have assemblies of 5,000 students, left, right, everywhere, and the decision is taken for everyone. So obviously there are right-wing, in the members of CLASSE, where we have, like I said, 100,000 members, a lot of them are right-wing, but the decisions are taken by our General Assemblies. It's not an individual, it's not an individual decision. It's exactly the same structure as a union. Exactly.
But of course, at many times, especially at the beginning of the strike, a lot of people that were more right-wing tried to discredit the process of the General Assembly, saying that it wasn't democratic and everything, by saying that they were being imposed of being on strike. But as the strike went on, the democratic culture of the General Assemblies began to be more known by everybody in the CEGEPs and in the universities, and people began to respect the democratic decisions that were made in the General Assemblies as they got used to it, and that as they got involved in it. Even the right-wing people got involved in the General Assemblies when they understood how it worked, and when they understood that people believed in the fact that when the decision is made collectively by all of the members of the people of the union, you have to respect it. So they began participating in the General Assemblies, which is what we wanted them to do, of course.
And even when the administration decided to stop to recognize the strike mandates, in a few places we saw green squares, so students against the strike and for the tuition increase on the pickup lines, with the red squares saying in fact that even if we're for the increase and we're against the strike, we still think that the collective decision has to be, that has been taken by everyone, has to be respected. Whatever the way you voted in the assembly, the will of the assembly, the will of the assembly.
It happened a lot when some administrations in the CEGEPs tried to force the students to go back to class against the decision that was made in the General Assembly. We saw a lot of people that were against the strike that went on the good line saying, you know, the decision has been made democratically, we have to respect it.
Okay, we're getting near the end. Maybe take a couple more questions and maybe just or
Yeah, I was just hoping you could speak a bit about the class attitude to mainstream media.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
I was hoping that maybe you could speak a little bit about CLASSE's attitude towards the mainstream media and mainstream media's treatment of the movement and maybe the alternative media's. I was hoping to hear Ethan's opinion on that as well.
I think we're gonna
take a few questions and then finish.
answer them.
Okay, there's one here, and one over here.
I actually had 2 questions, but I guess I could just do one.
Ask them so.
I know that the PQ is supposed to have the education summit, which is coming up, right? Or this summit on education,
Yeah.
the PQ, right? I know the class is going to be attending that, and I wonder, given the fact that, I mean, I take it as an obvious fact that it was an opportunistic, approach from the PQ to be voted in, and Mabua already said that she's not going to abolish tuition fees, right? She's sort of against free education. So what you feel the role of the class is going to be at these meetings, A. And I guess the second question would be broader in reference to leftist radical politics in Quebec and its relation to sovereignty. And it sort of oftentimes takes that role. And for me, the sort of strike, I am from Montreal, by the way, so that strike sort of broke down the relation between sovereignty and radical politics, right? That's obviously often associated with that. But what was interesting was that the elections themselves, right? It was not a wipeout of Charest, and that a lot of people, at least from the English-speaking background, were dissatisfied with liberals, but were afraid to vote PQ or Quebec Solidaire precisely because of this sovereignty issue again. And so, if you could just comment on that.
Yeah, I noticed that high school students were participating. How many high school students participated, and did they have a similar structure? And what about graduate students? And what kind of support did you get from graduate students?
So I will answer the question of the media, mainly my role to reconstruct. The relationship between class and the mainstream media is a very intense relationship. It always has been a very rude debate inside our organization to know what attitude we were going to adopt in front of the mainstream media. Because obviously, as students and as left-wing activists, we have those critics of the mainstream media being in defense of some interests, being oriented toward a certain direction, being reluctant to cover some other things. We were buying, let's say, this critique. But to build a massive movement like we did, we have no choice but to consider them, and not only to consider them, but I will say to put serious energy and serious resources in going into the mainstream media with our message. What I often say is that I deeply think that we are right, that we're doing the right thing, and that we have the best ideas. But if we keep them for ourselves, what is it worth? I think, and that was the approach of CLASSE, that we would refuse no tribune for our ideas. That means going in the right-wing media. That means being mocked. That means being ridiculized often by some media. And I think, and I still think, after those 6 months of intense media coverage, that it's the thing to do for social movements. It does not mean to adapt your strategy and your ideas for what the mainstream media wants. That's the trap in which a lot of unions and student organizations have fallen into. To say, because we do media, we have to do like the media wants us to do. We never let the media determine what we should demand or not demand. We never let the media decide what action we should do and what action we should not do. We never let the media tell us that we're too radical, we're too militant, and we should do more peaceful. We said we're gonna be our way, and the media are the key for us to explain why we're being radical, why we're blocking our universities, why are we blocking our CEGEP, why are we demanding free school and not only tuition fees. And that was our approach. Obviously, we also put a lot of energy to develop our own media. We put a lot of energy on alternative media. We were unbelievably active on social networks, obviously. But I think we see that as something that is complementary to our strategy of going in all the newspapers, all the TVs, and all the radios, to everywhere saying exactly the same message, and that no one in Quebec could not say that they do not have heard our ideas. And I think that we would never have had a so huge movement if we had decided to, say, oh, the mainstream media, they're right wing, so let's distribute flyers and
let's try to please the public opinion.
And at the opposite, the fact that we went to the mainstream media didn't make us change the way we talk or the way we mobilize.
On the question about the PQ summit, just so that everybody knows what I'm talking about, first of all, when the PQ was elected, well, even before it was elected, what promise Pauline Marois did was she said that the tuition hike was going to be canceled until the PQ was going to hold a summit 100 days after the election day on the 18th. So we still don't know exactly how the summit is going to work, who's going to be invited, how the decisions are going to be made exactly. And actually, the specific strategy of the class at the summit is being decided right now in the Congress in Quebec City as we are speaking. So I can't tell you the exact strategy that the class is gonna put forward because it's being decided right now. But one thing I know is, of course, as we were saying earlier, the class position on education is free education. And so, of course, that's the position that we are going to try to put forward. Our reflection is of course, based on studies that has been evidence that before that free education is more than possible. But what we know for now is that the PQ's position is the indexation of the education fees, which means that the education fees are like they increase in the proportion of the cost of living. So that's a hike, and of course we're gonna be against this position if that's the PQ is proposed. And that's all I can tell you right now.
And the two last questions, high schools were on strike, but it was really there are not really any student associations in the high schools. It was really spontaneous strikes, few days here and there for specific protests, block of days. It was not coordinated, it was not very organized. So it was the situation in high schools. On the question about independence and the left-wing debate in Quebec. Historically in Quebec, the idea of the debate around the national independence has taken the scene, has taken the political scene, and a lot of analysts say that this year and this strike is probably one of the first time where in Quebec we had really a political debate between the left and the right, and not a debate about independence or not. Historically, the left-wing movements in Quebec have been very, very close to the independence movements. In fact, in the city of Quebec, they have been the same movement in the majority of our history. That could be explained by very obvious historical facts. Just the fact that the people who were the working class, they were the francophones. So the unions started as francophone unions. The student movement started as francophone students wanting to go to universities. So naturally, the left was francophone, and because the ruling class was anglophone, obviously the right wing was anglophone. But that's let's say, the initial situation. Since then, things have evolved. But today, it could be a challenge to find in Quebec people that are left-wing and that are not for independence. So this strike has been really an exception in this situation where the debate was really between the left and the right, and not that about the independence people and people that are against independence. But I have to admit that, and I think it's everyone who went into a protest could say it, even if the movement was not about independence, this idea was clearly present. It was there, you could feel it. We had, 4 protests of more than 200,000 people in the street, and there was tens of thousands of Quebec flag, and I honestly never saw one Canada flag. So that's a really symbolic example, but I mean, it says something that I think, and now I'm not a spokesperson anymore, so I can say that, but I think what we are seeing today in Quebec, these days, in the last months, is really a renewal of this project of independence that is less motivated by cultural or linguistic arguments, but more and more by social and political arguments. And I think the last federal election sent a very clear message to the Quebecers that for one of the first time in the history of Canada, a majority government has been elected without them, totally without them. And that's clearly, I think that sent a message to a lot of Quebec students, and I think what we are seeing is this idea of independence being more inclusive than ever, and there is this strong link that is beginning to be understood by a lot of students between social emancipation and national emancipation. One being inseparable with the other. And that was probably the message that we were hearing in the last months in Quebec. And Québec solidaire, the birth of Québec solidaire is another proof of that, because Québec solidaire bears exactly this idea of social and national emancipation as being one project and not like PQ used to do, 2 separated projects. So
Thank you. Just want to say a few words of thanks. This session today came about as a result of the fact that about a month ago, I walked into the waiting lounge in the Vancouver airport, and the first thing that I saw was the Carré Rouge, and I had a closer look at the person who was attached to it, and realized that I recognized his face immediately, so I went over and introduced myself to Gabriel, and I told him that I was a great admirer of the movement and what had been accomplished in Quebec, and not only because they understood that it was not about tuition, it was not about just tuition in Quebec, but it was about a much broader neoliberal agenda, and I really admired that kind of analysis that was behind the whole movement. And he said, I think that you ought to come and talk to people at King's College. And he said, yes. So he gave me his email, put me in touch with Ethan, who just happened to be organizing this cross-Canada tour. And so they're here today as a result of all of that. And I want to thank all of you very much for your contributions today, for being here, and for making us the first stop on your cross-Canada tour. Thanks very much. If you haven't had an opportunity to make a contribution to the pot on the way out, it would be nice to do that. Patty Dalton, who's sitting at the back, also has a couple of announcements I think that she would like to make.
Yes, and I'll be quick, but first of all, we salute your courage and we continue to learn from your remarkable movement. Thank you very much for being here. We actually have a number of people on the organizing group for our Common Front People's Assembly here, and Anthony is on the organizing group and he's going to speak to our People's Assembly.
Okay. All right, Common Front is a group that's been put together to fight this very austerity that they're speaking about. It's being put together with the Ontario Federation of Labour and a bunch of community groups, and they're trying to draw students in as well. And London is fortunate enough to have a group that was sort of already ahead of the curve by being involved in the CAW strike at Caterpillar in the winter. So we're going to host the first regional assembly, and we think it's going to have a lot of influence about the direction and the way this develops, and we'd really like it if everybody could come out and take part. We're setting up some good speakers, we're having breakout sessions, there'll be food, and then we're screening the movie We Are Wisconsin, which is about the movement that happened in Wisconsin as well. Maybe not as spectacular as Quebec, but pretty inspirational. And so yeah, I mean, it's free, and it's at the Oxu Hall on Dearness Drive on October 13th, and we'd really love to see everybody come out. Thanks, Ed.
And I just also wanted to take a second to say that we should also thank Rabble.ca, Lead Now, and the Communications, Energy, and Paper Workers Union, who are the national sponsors of the tour. So just throwing that out there as well.
Also, if anyone really feels encouraged after this tonight, at the East London Cafe on Dundas Street, we're having an open mic, so there'll be information, music, spoken word, education about CETA, which will adversely affect how education funding is going to be happening in this country. So if anyone